Hello, and welcome to the 8:30 Live. Although, yeah, I know a few minutes late, but it's rough these days. Oh, and YouTube just kicked in, so hello, welcome to the 8:30 Live. And yeah, I get it a few minutes late, but still, what's to be said? I don't get paid for this, this is just public service. So, as we wait for the live to get disseminated out there and for folks to tune in, I figured we'd do what we normally do, which is just cover some of the quicker items in the news. Oh, we've already got people tuning in, which is fantastic. But the first thing, hey, Simon, what's going on? The first thing I'd really like to bring up is something that's been getting shared around on social media from Bay Ridge. And it's a really, really disconcerting, racist flyer about the Chinese community there. And I want to say two things. First, obviously, racism is bad, and this flyer is absolutely egregious. The thing they're talking about is how, thank you, and I appreciate that. You definitely know something's wrong when I'm not here for the 8:30 Live. I love doing it, and it definitely keeps me, buoys my spirits to see everybody, and I hope it buoys everybody else's spirits to engage in conversation. But yeah, definitely, if I don't do a live, it might be because I'm arrested or what have you. But getting back to the topic I was addressing, there was an incredibly racist flyer that's been passed around social media that was spotted in Bay Ridge. The councilman, Justin Brennan, has already issued a statement on it. But two things. First, the flyer is obviously, it's incredibly racist, and it's bad, and it's wrong, and we should condemn it. And it is about the Chinese community in Bay Ridge, basically blaming them, as you might be aware, because there's a common conspiracy theory, for the coronavirus and the pandemic, and calling them unhygienic and the source of this virus. And this, of course, comes from rhetoric that the president is uttering. And really, when we have leaders who normalize things like calling the coronavirus the Chinese virus, it simply gins up that animosity. So I've heard lots of arguments about like, oh, well, we have Ebola virus and Ebola is a place, that's where it comes from. And there's Middle East respiratory syndrome and all the other things. And things are commonly named for where they're from, but, they're not named for ethnicities. There's no Ebolanese. There are people from the Ebola region, I suppose, and there's folks from the Middle East, but it's not Middle Eastern virus. It's the Middle East. It's a region. So this could be an East Asian SARS virus. But even then, I think we should just get into the habit of calling things by their actual name. This is SARS-CoV-2. It causes the illness COVID-19. But the more important thing to be said about this isn't to say that there's a racist flyer and we should condemn it. Of course, I think everybody here would agree that we should condemn racism. The more important thing to say is that racism is something that we all have to tackle together, and we are not in this individually. The Asian community has to stand with the African American community. The African American community has to stand with the Hispanic and Latino community, and vice versa. We all have to support each other, and the white community obviously has to stand with all of us as well. The fight against racism isn't limited to the group which is currently beset upon, and we all know where this goes. First, it's the name calling, then it's the rationalizations for why these people are different and bad, then it's the scapegoating, and it ends in murder. And that's not theoretical, we've seen it. And it's also not a callback to the Holocaust, where that's, again, theoretical or philosophical in the past for a lot of people. It's happening right now. This entire rebellion, this revolution, this movement was kicked off because we have state-sanctioned murder of minorities, which simply don't get any justice. And so it's not okay for one minority to sit it out while another one is under threat. An injustice to one is an injustice to all. Or as Martin Luther King would say, as Dr. King would say, injustice anywhere is a threat to justice anywhere. And so I want to call out one more thing which I saw, which was an article from a Jewish magazine. Now, the Jewish community was a tremendous ally to the African American community in the original civil rights movement, being deeply involved in registering them to vote and participating in Freedom Summer. And a lot of young Jews were leaders in their communities to build allyship and undertake marches and protests and actions with Black Americans. There was an article that got passed around that I saw in a Jewish magazine, which is basically praising folks like Candace Owen and saying that the Black community, basically saying that the Jewish community has suffered so much and hasn't whined about it. Instead of playing the victim for years and years and years, it has instead picked itself up and, made something of itself. It's the most condescending thing I've read in some time, and it's absolute bullshit. And to be fair, there's plenty of Jews who use the victimization of the past to rightly justify the fact that they need extra measures of security and protection in the modern day. Anti-Semitism is still alive and well. And that doesn't make you a victim. It doesn't make you play the victim to say that, hey, there was stuff that happened in the past and it's still dangerous for us. We need some help here. That doesn't mean that you're, suckling off the teat of the state or consuming resources that you don't deserve. And African Americans in this country have been beset upon for so long. There is intergenerational trauma and deprivation of wealth, because if your father and mother didn't have enough money to buy a house, you're not inheriting a house, and that house isn't going to appreciate in value, and you're not going to be able to accumulate generational wealth in that way, which is something that a lot of families are able to do. In fact, that was the main basis of the GI Bill. When folks came back from World War II, white Americans were given an opportunity to buy subsidized housing and build wealth for their communities and for their families that way. And African Americans were really left out of that entire bonanza. So that is all just to say, everybody has a role to play in this, and particularly other minorities, other ethnic groups that aren't the most well-positioned one, the most privileged one. We all have to stick together. Just because Asians might feel like they have a little bit more of a slice of the pie, or Jews might feel that, well, the Holocaust happened, that's not a rationale for division. That is, in fact, just an opportunity to come together, to share what we've accomplished with others, and to recognize the pain of others and help them achieve more. All right, so that was the sort of short thing. Oh, Dorian Key, yeah, I thought you weren't coming. I'm always coming. So that was the short thing I wanted to kick off the live with. Michael Kaplan put a link in here. New Jersey Globe, local Trenton councilman defends McBride, says Jews down is just a statement of speech. Oh, yeah. I remember this. This was a little while ago, though, that a New Jersey politician, I guess he's a councilman, used the term Jew down, which I had never actually heard, but apparently means to cheat or try and swindle or to negotiate downward. And we have lots of great words for that: cheat, swindle, negotiate, bargain. All of those words already exist. Why does it have to be Jew down? It's I personally think it's inexcusable. And we spoke about this a few nights ago about the tagging of particular terms which are derogatory with a group of people. And I won't repeat the word which was used, but whenever you attach a group's label, whenever you attach the name of a group to a label that you ascribe to somebody else, and you use it either in a positive or negative way, all that does is reinforce the idea that group fits that stereotype. But it's often done in a negative way. But so, like, to Jew down, if that's used negatively, whether or not it's just a turn of phrase, it is a turn of phrase which implies that all Jews are bad, that they are doing something negative, that there's something inherent to being Jewish, which is thieving or underhanded. And we don't want that to happen, and it's wrong to do it. Whew. It's hot. I got to stop wearing the sweater. and also stop taking showers right before the live, but whatever. My day is cramped, people. It doesn't, it's not that easy. But I am wearing my Elizabeth Warren t-shirt. All right, I'm gonna have to stop wearing the sweater though. It's just too hot in the summer. I thought I would pull it off as like a joke, but it ain't happening. Dorian Key, do you think our police should not be able to carry guns like the police in UK, Japan, or Belgium? Japan had a total of 3 deaths last year from police arresting someone versus in the thousands for the US yearly. Okay, this is a great question because I had a long thread about this on Facebook, like 50 something comments deep. So first and foremost, just to directly answer that question, that's not really feasible because you can't have an entirely unarmed police force because of the prevalence of guns in the United States. And this has to do with America's relationship to civilian ownership of firearms. But that's it's a related but entirely other question, which is thorny and difficult to resolve in its own right. That being said, what I posted online was, what if we required all police officers who carried a firearm and had command of other officers to receive a Master's of Social Work or equivalent degree or certification? And there was a lot of debate over whether or not certifications or what have you actually make a difference. But from my perspective, a scheme like that would accomplish 2 things. First, you don't just give everybody a gun. And we'll talk about the pros and cons of that in a second. But you don't just give everybody a gun. The right to have a firearm, the right to bear weaponry is something you earn through displaying the capacity to solve conflict and understand problems in something other than a militaristic way. The second thing it does is, I believe, it helps to change the culture. This isn't just like implicit bias training for everybody that everybody has to go through. And it's just sort of like, whether you do it or not, or whether you're good at it or not, you still get to be an officer with a gun. You still get to move up the ranks. This is much more like officer candidate school in the military, where if you're up for promotion, you have to go through this very rigorous course and you have to pass it. Otherwise, you don't receive your promotion, you don't become an officer. In this case, you wouldn't receive a firearm and you wouldn't have the opportunity to lead other police. You wouldn't be able to progress the ranks and command units. So what I would hope this would do is create, one, a much stronger culture of professionalism, and it would lead to promotions based on different characteristics. So right now, you get promoted for being the best at policing, which really in our culture is the best at being militant, militaristic, and doing police tactics and such things. This would put the emphasis, if the chain of command, if promotion, if career path development meant going through the social work route, it would change the type of people who excelled at that type of work and who ended up in charge of the police force, which would gradually over time lead to a command structure which dictated a different sort of culture than what we have right now. Now, that being said, there were responses to the effect of, well, what we should be doing is defunding the police. We should be having other programs that aren't the police at all. And there were also statements to the effect of, this training doesn't make a difference. There's lots of evidence that shows that trainings don't impact outcomes, and then that this would be exclusionary to people who aren't wealthy, and particularly to minorities who don't have access to education. So I think there's a lot of issues still wrapped up in this, of course. Ideally, we want to get to a point where everybody has access to college education, and certainly, as in officer candidate school in the military, I would say that the police force is required, the government is required for people tagged and flagged for promotion to provide them with the requisite training and access to education, right? So if you join the police force, say, directly out of high school, maybe there's a job for you there, but you don't get to carry a firearm until you've gone through, your social work or equivalent type of mediation courses and pass them. and done well and proven that you know how to execute on those tactics. The second thing to talk about is whether or not this would this actually works. And I don't think there's a lot of data about something like a program like this because the way we treat trainings and bias trainings and all these other things isn't as a necessity for advancement. We basically take the tactic, we want everybody to do this. This is mandatory. You have to sit through your implicit bias training and you have to take it. And if you don't pass it, well, there is, as far as I can tell, there's not like a pass fail, right? Nobody gets fired because they didn't do well enough in the implicit bias training. Nobody loses their right to carry a gun because they didn't do well enough in the implicit bias training. And I think this is the difference. There's no consequences for failing or not doing well. We're basically just setting a very low standard and trying to get everybody to pass it. Whereas what we want to do is set a very high bar, a very, very strict bar, and then require that those who would be in leadership pass it, so that you cannot be in leadership without actually excelling in these things and demonstrating that to higher ups. But then there's the question of whether or not you actually can do policing without guns in America. And for this, I would say, all right, I understand that there's definitely danger out there. And I'd say a few things. First, what a lot of people are proposing already is to have a core of social workers, mental health professionals, and what have you, be there to take up the slack of the police and to have the police only do the physical aspect. Okay, I think that's great. Now, to have people on the street doing this, it can get very dicey. It can be dangerous. And so my perspective is you'd want those police officers to be nearby, or you'd want to have teams of embedded officers who have the right to bear a firearm and have gone through extensive training in larger teams that include mainly people who don't have firearms. Because if you're going to do canvassing, police canvassing, you're going to do investigation, you're going to stop people on the street, you're going to issue tickets. Why do you need guns for that? Why do you need to have a militaristic perspective on this? Why wouldn't you have the folks who are, most likely to de-escalate on every possible case where a firearm is not required? Then if you feel a firearm is required, a senior, a veteran officer who has access to that sort of equipment would be on hand, but they wouldn't be the first responder per se, or they wouldn't be the one to come out first or to make first contact, right? You want to, because once you come out with weaponry, that escalates the situation. Suddenly people are tense, people are scared. So you want to hold that back. You first want to go out, hey, nobody sends in a negotiator. I mean, maybe they get sent in with guns, but generally speaking, you ask the negotiators, hey, I'm unarmed. And why does that make a difference? Why does it make a difference in talking to be unarmed? Because now there's not a power imbalance. The second thing I would say about it is just that if you feel like you're in a situation where you need guns, call for backup. That is basic police work 101 anyway. You don't just run in guns blazing, you and your partner. You call for backup if you think there's a dangerous situation. So if there's a dangerous situation, you shouldn't be going in there regardless of whether you have a gun or not, which means you have the opportunity to ask for armed backup if you think the situation requires it. So that's sort of what I would say about that. I'm not saying that we shouldn't defund the NYPD. I'm not saying that I'm against any of those other ideas. I don't view this as in conflict. The NYPD, as we've said, has a budget of $6 billion plus capital expenses. I hardly see the need for all of that money to go into a singular program of creating a militaristic organization of 38,000 people, all of whom carry guns, very few of whom have proven themselves worthy of carrying it, which is not to say that a lot of them aren't worthy of carrying it. I have zero idea because there's no demonstration, I think, that they are worthy, and we don't have access to any disciplinary records because of 50A. So hashtag repeal 50A. All right, let's see if there's any questions here. Denmark had 0. US is on par with countries like Brazil, Angola, and Saudi Arabia. I mean, Denmark's a very small country, and I don't mean that to say that, like, per capita, if you adjusted per capita, we'd be doing better. What I mean to say is that when you have small countries with a small number of people, the degree to which things get out of hand tends to be much lower. You simply don't have the population density, and you don't have the wealth inequality. You don't have a lot of the factors, and you certainly don't have the racial disparities. Denmark is significantly more homogenous than the United States that tend to breed conflict, which is why we need mediation, because so many of these issues have nothing to do with actual violence. We simply end up in a violent situation because that's our go-to solution for solving, quote, solving the problem. Michael Kaplan, as a side note, my family was one of the first Jewish ones allowed to move to Westchester. Oh, well, I guess that's nice. Kaplan, for once we were slaves in Egypt. Probably building on my earlier theme of all folks, all minorities should basically stick together and have solidarity, not because they're competing to get ahead of the next minority, but because we all suffer in the same way or in similar ways, and we can all learn from each other. Which, again, is not to say that white folk don't have a role in this. They do. It's just that far too often, people who are oppressed get mad at other people who are oppressed for the oppression, and that's just not how it should work. But we discussed it earlier, so you can rewind if you want to see, if you want to talk through that. Michael Kaplan. She then called the first openly gay mayor of Trenton a sea-sucker at a council meeting recently. So this is the New Jersey council member who apparently she had used the term Jew down, and we were just talking earlier again about what makes a term derogatory. And so if you are unclear on that or want to check any of the words you use against a good standard, I would say rewind a little bit and go check it out. Simon Sachs, do you have an air conditioner? I do have an air conditioner, Simon, and it's not on, and it's a waste of energy, or I want to use it as little as possible, and I just can't justify it. It's not that hot out. I just insist on running the fireplace and wearing a sweater because that's what I've been doing for the last... Did you know that this is episode 46 of the 8:30 Live? And before that, it was the fireplace. So we're like 50-something episodes in now, at least, on these nightly chats. So we've been doing this since quarantine. This really started over quarantine. So thanks everybody for sticking with it. Julianne Ballington, what do you make of abolishing the police? As a functional idea, it's basically impossible. You'll always need law enforcement, and at some point, at some level, you'll probably need the use of force in certain cases. That will always likely be necessary. So I don't believe that it's functionally practical to abolish the police entirely. I think there are a lot of things that we could be doing that would reduce the need for police, providing adequate mental health, making social workers a first line of defense, not against violent people, but against inequities and against domestic disturbances and disputes, I guess you'd say, so that people don't have to resort to violence. But I find it very unlikely that we're going to get to a place where there's no need at all for any sort of use of force to control or to execute on law enforcement. Dorian Key, Ben, people own guns in those countries. Belgium has a proud history of gun ownership and gun manufacturing. Yes, but they have much stricter gun control laws, and access to firearms is curtailed. Switzerland being a great example. In Switzerland, everybody's in the militia. Everybody actually has to go to boot camp. Everybody has to re-up on their accreditation to own a firearm every year. Everybody, gets a gun if they can do that, but if you can't do that, you don't get a gun. Here in the United States, it's just, do you want a gun? Oh, here's a gun. Do you want to shoot people? Well, that's really not any of my business. So here's, an assault rifle. So the way they do gun ownership, even though gun ownership is prevalent, their relationship to guns and violence is different. Dorian Key, our police force would still have guns. In those countries, there are specialized squads, SWAT, that have guns, but they are only called in when they are needed. The rank and file only have batons. And that's sort of what I was suggesting, that the vast majority of police officers don't really need firearms. Why not about the vast majority? What the exact proportion would be, I can't really say. I might go as far as to like hazard a 1-to-3 or a 1-to-5 ratio, thinking about the the size of like how big you might want units and how closely you might want people to work together, and the rate at which you might be able to promote people. Understanding that they need to have these certifications to move up the ranks, but I'm not going to make a determination of that. But what I will say is that I agree with you that specialized units or specialized embedded officers in units should be the ones to have firearms and make those judgments, who have gone through more extensive training, who have demonstrated their capacity at mediation and de-escalation, and not just your regular person on the street who's gone maybe through basic and maybe and gone through the academy. There needs to be more if you're going to command other officers, command life and death situations, and have a gun yourself. And so this would sort of be like a SWAT within a police squad or a unit. And then, you have different levels of escalation requiring based on the need. So yeah, you'd have like your firearm user in your unit. And then if you needed more firearm users, you could call that in for backup. And then if you had to escalate, you could call in for SWAT being special weapons and tactics. And that was invented really to deal with times when criminals or civilians had high-powered firearms, because that's the thing that we have somewhat uniquely in the United States. There's a lot of folks who have access to assault rifles, and you don't want the police to be outgunned, but you don't want every police officer to be a military unit with assault rifles. So you have that tucked away, and you phone in when you need that help. I actually got most of my thinking for the structure of this from the way the military operates. Usually in the military, you'll have a squad of 4 to 6 people. All of them will have, their assault rifles or what have you. Well, back in like World War II, everybody would have a rifle, but only the commanding officer of the squad, so the sergeant, or maybe even the company commander, the lieutenant, would have a sidearm. Okay, and so the types of weapons people were issued were reliant on their rank, and you'd have a machine gunner who was trained specifically in the machine gunning, and so you have the specialization of units. It's not a bizarre concept, and it's certainly not bizarre to military organizations. The only thing that I'm suggesting here is that instead of everybody starting with a gun and then going up from there to bigger and bigger guns, everybody starts with no gun. Everybody starts with their words, and then you escalate from there to people who have batons and mace, and people who have firearms and who are qualified and rated to do these things and have passed higher thresholds to achieve that right. And then, of course, if you want to be a commander, if you want to be in charge of other officers who have control over life and death and the use of force, then you must be even more qualified. Dorian Key, New York City has an army of police over 30,000. That's basically an army. Do we need that many officers? Other first world countries have less officer per capita than the United States. Yes. I think this is certainly a debate, and it's gone back and forth over the course of New York's history. I think we have to understand where all of this came from, which is that in the 70s and 80s, New York was really in bad shape. New York went bankrupt in the 70s. And because of all of the unrest that occurred in the 70s and 80s, there was a really big, and this is not just in New York City, but nationally, a huge law and order push. I mean, this is why we have the crime bill. This is why Bill Clinton took tough on crime from the Republicans to become president. It was such a big issue that the soft on crime mentality, or the idea that criminals are also humans, just wasn't flying for the general public. I mean, the crime bill, we can go on and on about how Joe Biden authored the crime bill, and the crime bill has been awful, and it has been. But at the time, there were communities calling for tougher laws, Black communities calling for tougher laws, because of the difficulties they were having with crime and gang violence where they lived. And so the crime bill, as draconian and ridiculous in its thesis for how to resolve crime, as as draconian and ridiculous as it was, it was instituted to meet a need that people saw at that time. Now, there are a lot of reasons that crime dropped precipitously, and really it's not because of the crime bill, it's because of larger socioeconomic and political factors, at least in my esteem and in much of the literature. But that's why we came to this. That's how we ended up in this moment. And when Giuliani was mayor, he ran on like tough on crime. He added 1,000 cops to New York streets. That was a whole thing. Or was that Bloomberg who added 1,000 cops? Maybe it was Bloomberg after Giuliani. Like, this continued on, and 9/11 only made it worse. 9/11 only made the idea of law enforcement in every corner checking everybody's bags that much more appealing. So do we actually need 38,000 police officers in New York City? I'd honestly say probably not. Crime is ridiculously low. So low, in fact, that when officers are trying to make their quotas of tickets and arrests, they're just wantonly, randomly stopping people to try and get there. So that would sort of be my perspective on that, based on the history that I've lived in New York. Deidre, there isn't a pass-fail for implicit bias training, but it's not a de-escalation program. Therapeutic crisis intervention requires that you take a test. Okay, so there you have it. Deidre Levy, maybe restructuring the police department and focus more on community building initiatives. I definitely would agree with a restructuring of the police department and also a defunding largely of the police department and community building initiatives. Yes, I mean, basically taking the money that you would take from the police department and putting it into other programs for crime prevention, recidivism prevention, and community resources. And this is all there to mediate and mitigate the reasons we have crime, so that when you do actually have somebody who is violent for a reason that's not because they're in poverty, not because they're oppressed, but because maybe they have a mental issue or any other number of things, that's the only time that you have to call in somebody who is trained in the use of force. Julianne Ballington, people are calling to abolish the police. Yeah, well, people are calling to abolish jails too, but I don't really think that you can abolish jails. I think we can get to a much, much smaller jail population, particularly if we stop criminalizing things that don't hurt anybody, like, use of marijuana and things like this, and taking a hard look at the criminal code. But it's fine if people want to call to abolish the police. I just don't view that as a practical end state or sustainable at the very least. Michael Kaplan, does the production company have to pay you more if you get to 50 episodes? I wish anybody paid me anything. Deidre Levy, started with Giuliani. Yeah, that's what I thought. Because he beat Dinkins, right? And Dinkins was a Democrat, and Giuliani ran on like law and order. Oh yeah, he was like a prosecutor, right? So his whole thing was like, oh, New York's in chaos. We need more police. We need more law and order. Dorian Key, if you had to pick one OECD high-income capital in the world that you admire the most for their social and economic policies, which country would that be? Why does it seem generally small countries, Norway, Luxembourg, Netherlands, Denmark, Canada, seem to govern better than larger ones, France, Spain, UK, US? What do you mean by better? I mean, France, the United Kingdom, and the US are some of the richest, most powerful countries in the world. Norway, Luxembourg, Netherlands, and Denmark they're nobody. They're basically nobody. I think a large part of it, honestly, has to do with the fact that the post-World War II global order, is basically underwritten by U.S. military spending and America operating as the global police. Now we can talk about U.S. hegemony and whether it's a good thing or a bad thing, and whether the liberal world order that came up after World War II was a good thing or a bad thing. But at the end of the day, when you are not the security guarantor of allies across the globe, the United States is the security guarantor for Japan, which has no military, we'll just say for the sake of argument, they have no military. I don't want to get into the defense force thing right now, but you're the guarantor of security for, South Korea, for Eastern Europe, for Western Europe. Basically, you're everybody's security guarantor for 50 years, except France and the United Kingdom, which developed their own nuclear weapons, right? You're spending so much more of your money on the military while everybody else gets to invest in their social programs and their economy and their education. So, I don't think it's really fair to be like, why do small countries do better? The United States is the army for Norway, Luxembourg, Netherlands, Denmark, and kind of Canada. Canada's not worried about anybody invading them except the United States, because the United States is next door. I mean, just try to remember the Cold War and who was in charge of shit and who spent all the money developing all the weapons and all the nukes. Russia, basically, and the United States. Russia bankrupted itself, and the United States had a lot of problems. The United States spends more on the military than the next 10 countries combined. So, a lot of this has to do with where your budget priorities are and where you're putting all of your spending. All of these other countries, which have high GDP per capita, decently high tax rates, they can reinvest in their countries, in their human capital, with education programs and all these other things. And the United States, this is why, NATO requires all of the other countries of NATO to spend 2% minimum of their GDP on defense. And yet, almost no country in NATO actually does that. In fact, I'm pretty positive no country has spent 2% of their GDP in NATO except the United States, which spends something like 5% of its GDP on defense, except maybe the United Kingdom. And this is when Donald Trump says that NATO is a bad deal or that Europe owes America money, he's talking about this. Technically, the European countries have not been living up to their treaty organization. They spend too little money on defense. And this is because they know that the United States is more than capable of defending all of them at once. And because of Article 5 of NATO, it's required to do so. But this means that the United States spends billions and billions and billions, hundreds of billions of dollars on defense that it could otherwise be spending on education, on the environment, on scientific research, on healthcare. And it doesn't. And so, I just don't really think it's fair to be like, why do small countries do better? They have such different obligations to themselves and to the world. Dorian Key. Sorry, I meant country, not capital. I see. Deirdre Levy? Again, I'm sorry. A whole lot of smaller countries are homogenous and lack diversity as well. Also true. Dorian Key. Better as in societal harmony, standard of living, crime rates, and GDP per capita. So societal harmony, I think, has to do with distribution of wealth and diversity. There is less wealth inequality in a lot of those countries. One, because of higher taxation rates, and two, because the American market is much larger, and we have much larger markets to which we can export, which means that economies of scale go farther. Standard of living and crime, a lot of this has to do with social programs. And whether or not people feel like they're being taken care of and how desperate they are and how oppressed they feel. And we spoke about how they don't spend their money on defense, and so they're able to privilege other priorities. GDP per capita. The United States has tremendously high GDP per capita. We're not terrible. We're not the best, but a lot of this has to do with, again, the wealth inequality and just the size of our population. Denmark has their sovereign wealth fund. They have their oil fields, and this is basically just added to their GDP, and everybody gets a share of it. So the way they run their economies are very different. So that if the GDP per capita in the United States were actually the per capita income of every American, I think we'd have a lot less disharmony socially. It would totally mess up the way our economy is structured, and I'm not advocating for it. Having everybody make exactly the same amount, regardless of what you do, does kill incentives of other things, but getting a lot closer to that than we are where one man is almost about to be a trillionaire and thousands, if not hundreds of thousands, are in poverty. You know, it's a push and pull. Deirdre, and the Scandinavian countries are mostly Anglican societies. Perhaps you mean Protestant, because Anglican is pretty much limited to England. Do you mean Protestant? Are they Protestant? I think maybe they're Protestant, but France is not. You're talking about Scandinavia. Yes. Are there any really successful Catholic countries? Well, by successful, I mean like placid. Is Switzerland Catholic? I can't remember. I don't think so, actually. It doesn't matter. Dorian Key, France, average yearly income per person is 33,000, whereas Netherlands is 35,000. Norway is 38,000. Now to America. Okay. Now I wanted to talk about one more thing, because then I can go eat. Oh, no, I want to talk about two more things. All right, even though I do want to talk about the smartphone thing, let's talk about the essential workers first, because this is just ridiculous. I highly encourage everybody to go check out an article in The City about an essential worker's attempt to get home, because this says everything you need to know about the New York City police force right now and the enforcement of curfew. You may be aware that there's a curfew in New York City, and you and I, as regular people, are not allowed to be outside. But in theory, essential workers are allowed to be outside. And I say in theory because according to one tale of an essential worker, and I believe this tale because a friend of mine is actually friends with this person, when they left their hospital job last night and attempted to go home, they ran into not one, not two, but 3 police barricades. Each time they were told they could not cross to get to their house and were given a detour workaround. This made our essential workers commute a solid 2.5 hours longer than it should have been. They didn't get home till 2:30 in the morning. This is absolutely ridiculous. It is a blatant violation of the law. And there's another blatant violation which took place during this violation. To use Judge Burke's term when explaining why the police don't have to give people a speedy trial anymore, this curfew is a crisis within a crisis. So we have our essential worker trying to get home. One of the police, they pull up to a barricade. One of the police officers, he's begging with them at the second barricade, "Please let me through. I'm an essential worker. You have to let me through." To which the police officer replies, "I don't have to do anything. You have to go." Which is, again, a blatant violation of the terms of the curfew. The police think that they're above the law. What makes this even more damning is that at one of these barricades, an officer in the squad car says over the loudspeaker, "And why don't you take those bumper stickers off his car while you're at it?" Now, it would be bad enough if the police just wanted to remove bumper stickers. But it's pretty clear this is because those bumper stickers were in support of Democratic candidates for president. Now, I don't want folks to just dismiss and be like, well, it's just bumper stickers, who cares? This is the police asserting the right or the idea that they can strip people of their political expression because they don't agree with it. Taking off somebody's bumper stickers because you don't like the political candidate they're supporting is wrong. But when the government does it, it's a violation of the First Amendment. The police have zero, absolute no right or power to take expressions of your political preference from your person or from your property. So I just feel like this entire night for this essential worker is a wonderful microcosm of everything that's going on and everything that is insidious about the current culture of the police. They believe that they are above the law, that if they don't feel like following orders, it doesn't pertain to them, and that they are the arbiters of what individuals in our society can and cannot do. Whether an essential worker can go home or not is up to them, regardless of what the mayor says. The political paraphernalia or the statements that you're allowed to make is up to them, regardless of what the Constitution may say. And this is reinforced by another story of a police officer who pushed over an elderly gentleman in Buffalo. Now, you might have seen the video. If you haven't seen it, it's intensely graphic, so watch it with caution. But essentially, in a march, in a line of officers marching, an elderly man, apparently 75 or so, walks up and starts talking with one of the officers, trying to prevent him from passing. Another officer steps in, pushes him back. He falls backwards, trips, smacks his head on the concrete, lays absolutely still, and starts bleeding from his ear. Now, bleeding from your ear is a sign of deep trauma to the brain and the skull. The whereabouts of that man are that he is now in stable but serious condition. The whereabouts of the officer who pushed him over is that he is suspended from the force. This happened last night. This is, people are saying, I've had some people be like, well, he gets due process, and I agree he gets due process. I agree everybody gets due process. Wait till the facts come out. But there's a video of this. There's not a lot of facts that aren't available to the general public, and certainly not to his superiors. He's suspended. And in protest of that suspension, I don't know if any of these people watched the video, but in protest of that suspension, 57 members of that police force in Buffalo resigned in support of their colleague who pushed over an elderly man who posed zero threat and had done nothing, and is now in critical condition because an officer felt like shoving him out of the way with reckless disregard, and I would argue excessive use of force. 57 officers of the police force resigned. Well, as far as I'm concerned, that's great. We don't need those 57 officers on the street behaving like that and backing up that sort of behavior. It's just we're the good apples, right? Well, as long as we can weed out all the bad apples, we'll only be left with the decent apples, hopefully. Now, the other thing that I'd like to point out, or I'd like to mention, is that right before this officer pushed over that elderly man, he was posing for a photo op, kneeling with the rest of the police officers in that line action. So even though we do see officers, we do see photographs and videos of police kneeling, shaking hands, doing whatever it is that they're doing for the camera, when it's all said and done, it is apparently not particularly meaningful or a particularly meaningful indicator of how they're going to behave when they're on duty. Wholly discouraging and really, really saddening to see this sort of behavior and that sort of reaction from other officers who should know better. But that being said, there is a positive note, which is that in Minneapolis, there is legitimate thought being put into the complete disbanding of the Minneapolis Police Department and replacing it with something entirely new. Now, this is cool. I think that's a really neat approach to build from scratch all over again. But I just want to remind people, before ICE was a thing and everybody hated ICE, there was INS. And INS was so bad that Congress disbanded it and started all over. And what they built was ICE. So just because people are talking about abolishing the police department doesn't mean you're going to get something better. And ultimately, unless you think about how force gets used and accept that force is going to have to be used at some point to guarantee law enforcement in some situations and protect the public in some situations, you're not going to realistically be able to create limitations on the police or whatever new entity you create. So I just really want folks to go into this with open eyes. Okay, so the last thing I wanted to, oh, great, now there's more comments. Of course there are. All right. Dorian. Also, life expectancy in Scandinavia is higher, and average fitness and health of a person is way better than the US and UK with our obesity epidemic. You still haven't named which country's policies you admire most. Admire most? Well, if I'm being honest, I can't tell the difference. I don't know the actual policy nuances that distinguish Denmark, Norway, and Finland and the rest of the Scandinavian countries. I think Switzerland is a really interesting example of a federated republic, and that's I go to Switzerland because they are a federal republic. The other countries you mentioned all have centralized governments. I think Switzerland's a really interesting example, not least because they're really into their militia, and if we're going to take a lesson from anywhere, I think it would behoove us to choose a place which takes the Second Amendment as seriously as Americans seem to want to take our own right to bear arms. And so for me, Switzerland's a particularly interesting place to draw lessons from. But of course, the Swiss have all sorts of other terrible, evil things done in the past. And so I don't know if I would really say we could wholesale. I mean, I guess I can say which ones I like the most, but honestly, I'm just not well versed enough in the policy differences between those countries. But I always have found Switzerland an interesting model. And when I read their history, I'm always like, oh, fascinating. They really figured out this federal democracy thing in a way that preserved the autonomy of the cantons and didn't create an overbearing federal administration like we have here in the United States. Deirdre, they are Anglican according to my grad program in comparative education, and we studied Finland and Sweden education systems. Interesting. I'm going to have to look into that. Dorian Key, Magna Carta tonight. Magna Carta before food. Okay. Julian Ballantyne, Calvinism, a branch of Protestantism, was founded in Switzerland. Now it seems that Catholicism and Protestantism is pretty much split. Right. Actually, I remember being part of the reason they have their federal system because the states couldn't agree on a religion. Deirdre Levy, I hate to generalize, and I don't think all cops are bad, but at the Brooklyn Bridge Memorial protest, many officers were not wearing masks, and when we told them to wear a mask, one of them coughed intentionally. Well, obviously, I'm not going to say all cops are bad because generalizations are bad, but those cops are assholes. Replying to Deirdre Levy, police can be incredibly petty and human like the rest of us. Indeed, which is why a smaller, more professional, more disciplined, more highly trained, more scrutinized, more accountable police force is probably the way to go. Now, the last thing I want to talk about, which I promise I talk about because on Facebook, and I just want to mention it, is actually speaking of that protest that got stuck on the bridge, is the fact that people on the bridge were saying that they could not live stream or take photographs and that those features were disabled on their cameras. Now, I bring this up because that's actually possible. There is a patent that Apple has which allows it to remotely turn off your ability to take photos and live stream. And in theory, they've done this for the purpose of preventing you from videotaping or taking photos at concerts, live events, and movies, and stealing other people's copyrighted material. But as James Morris King, who is often leaving comments in our discussions and who came on in one of our shared lives where we're able to bring somebody on, he works in AI, and he was talking about the way that law enforcement is soon going to be requiring phone and camera makers to upload software, to add software that screens pictures and blurs out nudity for children so that you can't create child pornography. That sort of software, which gives law enforcement access to functionality on your phone, can easily be turned into a civil rights issue. So while it's of course wonderful to say that we'd be able to prevent people from taking photos that exploit children, to have a blur feature like that might also be used to say, take live stream footage and photos of police officers and blur their faces and their badge numbers so that you can't identify them in photographs or live streams. Now, it's unclear whether or not it was actually Apple or law enforcement that was turning off people's capacity to send live stream footage or to take photos. We do know for a fact that in Washington, D.C., the military was jamming signal so that people couldn't live stream what was going on when the park was cleared by the military so that Donald Trump could do his photo op. But all of this just is to say we have to be very, very careful about what's happening to the devices we carry, how they might be used to infringe our civil liberties, and how much we rely on them for the things we're doing to guarantee our own rights. Because if our cameras can be turned off remotely by a corporation or by law enforcement, if the footage we take can be blurred in essence or in theory to do good things, but can also be used to blur police officers and identifying information and prevent folks from being held accountable, we're going to have a very difficult time. And so we've been talking about technology a lot lately. We've been talking about deep fakes. We've been talking about social media and the arbiters of truth. But this is just another thing that we've spoken about before that we should revisit and continue to bring up, because as we enter these tumultuous times, these are going to be increasingly important questions to ask and things to be aware of. Okay, so now, last comment from Dorian and then the Magna Carta. If we want to be like Switzerland, we would need to vastly take away power from the president, if not abolish it. Bro, that works for me. All right. The presidency is overrated. Or what I should say is that a powerful presidency, I think, is overrated. Which isn't to say that we don't need a president or that the union is bad or blah, 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 but the president didn't start off as powerful as the presidency currently is, and it should be restrained. We should have a little bit of a return to first principles. Okay, Magna Carta. Now, we've covered a lot. I'm not going to recap everything that we've read already. I did that yesterday. And yesterday, if you haven't seen it, it was a really great live. So I encourage you to go watch it. And I guess I'm supposed to try and turn these things into podcasts. If anybody wants to help me downloading the audio from all the videos and uploading them to a podcast thing, let me know, because it's a hassle and I don't want to do it myself. Haha. Anywho, I already do the thing. I already do the other thing. I do the talking thing. I'm here. I'm not eating dinner. Okay. The last thing we spoke about yesterday was debt and what happens if somebody has a debt that they've incurred and dies, and there was a promise that other earls and barons and the sovereign would not come and take their land if there were other ways to have the debt repaid, including taking rents over time. So this is about the sanctity of land and about the rights that you have to keep your assets and to pay over time with liquid assets that aren't your land holdings. That being said, 10, if anyone who has borrowed a sum of money from Jews dies before the debt has been repaid, his heir shall pay no interest on the debt for so long as he remains under age, irrespective of whom he holds his lands. If such a debt falls into the hands of the crown, it will take nothing except the principal sum specified in the bond. Well, that's interesting. 11, if a man dies owing money to Jews, his wife may have her dower and pay nothing towards the debt from it. If he leaves children that are under age, their needs may also be provided for on a scale appropriate to the size of his holding of lands. The debt is to be paid out of the residue, reserving the service due to his feudal lords. Debts owed to persons other than Jews are to be dealt with similarly. Okay. This sounds terrible on the face of it because it singles out a single religious group, the Jews. But one thing I'd like to point out is that in this time period, 1215, it's probably true that only Jews are allowed to be bankers. And this is because of Christian edicts against money lending. So the only people who are lending money happen to be Jews, unless, of course, we're talking about the sovereign and other lords who lent or borrowed money as gifts or what have you to each other. And we dealt before with debts owed to other lords and how they might fight for land because of their position in the landed gentry. And so basically what we have are a set of laws about debt. One, if you are in the landed class, you're not entitled to take somebody else's land and increase your holdings because they owe you money. And now, basically, if you're a banker, i.e. a Jew in this case, you are restricted in some regards. They actually don't, it's not like they're wiping out the debt or abolishing it. Instead, the debt is passed on to your heir, but they don't owe any interest on it until they come of age, at which point I suppose interest is then reestablished. And if that debt is transferred to the crown from the earl or the baron or the lord, then that debt is simply just the principal of that is paid, and there is no interest for the sovereign. It's nice. It's good to be the king, as Mel Brooks would say. And then secondly, in the event that there's a widow, she gets her dower, which is the money that her family paid for the marriage or what have you, and her inheritance, but she pays nothing towards the debt from her dower. So if she has no money except for the dower, the debt basically evaporates. And so this is actually very interesting. It's protecting people from indebtedness, and also it specifies as well that any debts owed to persons other than Jews be dealt with similarly. So these are really about debts of money owed, and these aren't folks who are entitled then to take land because they're not of the landed class. So it's interesting. It's an important piece because it enshrines the idea of debt and how debt is charged even after death, and how debt is passed down. And while this is not foundational to the Constitution, it's definitely an important part of English law, which has come across the United States. There's obviously a tremendous amount of law and thought that's gone into debt, and one of those things being bankruptcy. And of course, ironically, or maybe not ironically, because, well, here there's a tension and maybe some fairness between lenders and borrowers spelled out in the Magna Carta. But obviously here in the United States, we have situations where, for example, student debt can never be discharged. It can never be forgiven. You can never forgo interest on it. And here you've got a debt, like if you're underage, you get no interest on debt. If you're the sovereign, you just pay back the principal that's remaining. If you're a widow, you are given a nest egg and you're given your dower, and nobody can come and claim that in repayment for debt. Which, by the way, if your spouse dies here in the United States and they've left you debts, the banks will come for it, right? You don't have protections. It's not, you don't have a nugget that's just reserved for you, which is necessarily protected from creditors. So this is, as I read the Magna Carta, I'm always increasingly impressed by the sort of progressivism of it for the day, and how little has changed in some regards. In this case, in some measures, how we've slid backwards and reduced the rights of debtors. Although what I will say again is that this is not for regular people. Let's not fool ourselves in thinking that this is like the Constitution that ensures rights for everybody. This is about the landed and elite class in Britain. So with that, thank you all so much for tuning in, and go enjoy your Fridays. I'll see you tomorrow at 8:30.